Morning, Rabbi. Zion with base 47b. Now, from where we are to the end of the page is a little Fabrengen / social commentary from the Gemoro. So, right, because where we left off is that because promiscuity was getting too out of hand, the Sotah was called off, and its effectiveness is over, as the pasuk describes it. And Rabbi Gimple emailed me that once it becomes ineffective and you're erasing God's name for nothing, which is true. On the other hand, it still remains a mitzvah, and the effectiveness is God's business. And on the other hand, it doesn't help to explain why Eglah Rufa was called off. So this question is still unanswered, but it is a truth that we have to add to this equation that Hashem's name is being erased. At any rate, so having said that, as the world degenerates, Hashem's reaction is accordingly, right? The people degenerated into promiscuity. So Hashem no longer offers the clarity that the Sotah brings. People degenerated into murder. So Hashem no longer offers the atonement that Eglah Rufa brings. So from here going forward, although the Gemara doesn't say God's response is X, as in the first two cases, where it's like Torah is calling off Sotah or calling off Eglah Rufa, but the Gemara makes social comments on when things get out of hand, things get even more out of hand. The slippery slope type thing, where when this starts to become accepted, then it gets worse and it goes to this. When this becomes normalized, then this is what happens. Things of that nature. So each of these lines can be thought about and forblinked about and understood in a personal level, on a social commentary level. So very interesting Gemara. So it's about a third from the bottom, about halfway, little lower than halfway. The line begins with the words Boitkin Nishay Sechem, and then the third word is Misharabu. Misharabu Bale Hana. See it there? Mishal Rabu Bale Hana. When those who are masters of pleasure, they're too into self-gratification, just lacking discipline to, especially as Rashi puts it actually, is people who would take pleasures from others. Where's that Rashi? No, where I saw it in Steinsaltz. So Mishroba Balayana, when people became too excited about enjoying themselves, Nisafsu Adinim, judgments became corrupted. Legal ruling became corrupted because the judges are seeking out worldly pleasures. Will seek them out from wherever they get them. And that leads to a desire to what? To
bribe taking.
Let a bribe take, or even not even a bribe.
Because to get those pleasures.
There's a bribe, and then there's, even if you don't get a bribe, when people are too pursuant of pleasures, they tend to fawn over those who have, in hopes maybe I'll get, even if it's not an outright bribe, but they lose sight of what's right and wrong, because their eyes are colored by where do I get my delight, where do I get my pleasure, and that corrupts judgment. Biased
judgment.
That's correct. And therefore, in a skalkalo amaisin, therefore people's behavior gets all messed up. Because if I'm in a position of power, I don't have to do anything. I know I'm going to win. Part of the big boys club. And I know I'm going to be treated well. And therefore, there's if there's no pleasantry in the world, all pleasantry is gone, which is very interesting. Because it starts off with those pursuing pleasure and concludes with no noyach, no relaxation, no pleasure in the world. You end up losing the pleasure. There's no boundaries.
Seeming contradiction.
It's exactly right. In other words, if you really want to,
when you pursue pleasure, you lose pleasure.
That's right.
When you seek false pleasure, you lose real pleasure.
That's correct. If there's no boundaries, everything falls apart. There has to be boundaries. There's got to be discipline. When I take, when I don't take, when I enjoy, when I don't enjoy. And then you can enjoy. Then noyach ba'olam. Then there's pleasantry in the world. It's not the same word. Hana means like pleasure, like desire. And noyach is like similar to the word nachas, which is also pleasure, but a different kind of pleasure. It's more the pleasure of like being happy with oneself. Hana is like external pleasure, get stuff my face with food. How much enjoyment can I get?
Yeah.
Versus noyach is just to have inner peace. So there's the change in language. It starts off where you exchange the desire that we have for noyach, for inner peace, and you falsely interpret that as a desire for just hedonistic pleasure. Eventually, you lose out on what you were really looking for in the beginning, which is a proper inner peace. A noyach ba'olam, a certain calm, pleasantness in the world. And this happens on a social level too. When people are running after hedonistic pleasure, you can no longer see straight. Right? Nisafsu adinim, which we translated as judgment in law, becomes corrupted. But it can also be judgment in like how I judge the world around me becomes corrupted. I can't even see things straight because I'm constantly looking for where's my next hit.
There's a lot of people they have depressed, and even though they're constantly seeking pleasure.
That's right.
It's not fulfillment.
That's right. And that could be a different interpretation of this afsu adinim, not just as the Gemara, as the literal meaning is that the course become corrupted because people are seeking out pleasure and they're fawning over the ones who are rich because they hope they can get something out of it. But it could be this afsu adinim on a personal level. I lose my sense of judgment. I lose my sense of discernment. I can no longer see what's healthy for me, what's not healthy for me, because I'm constantly chasing my next hit. And because of that, my behavior gets messed up, not just on a societal level, but my behavior gets messed up. And then the noyach ba'olam, my world has no pleasantry. My world has no inner peace. It could be on not just on a social level, as this literal interpretation, but on a personal level also. I seek pleasure. I lose my sense of judgment. My behavior goes down a rabbit hole of just depravity, and then I have no inner peace in my world. Because to begin with, I interpreted my desire for inner peace as a desire for pleasure. What's the expression? Everybody has a God-shaped hole in their heart, and they're trying to fill it up with all kinds of other stuff. That's really what it is. Because inherently, we seek as biological creatures, we seek pleasure.
Sure. And
we avoid pain. But if we don't think of that in the long term, we don't think of that in terms of like what's truly inner peace, noyach ba'olam, and we exchange it for hana, for just hedonistic delight, things get way out of hand very quickly, or we destroy our own worlds on a social level and on a personal level. Yeah, sorry?
The moral compass becomes off kilter.
Very off kilter, that's right. And when the moral compass is off kilter, I end up suffering because there's no noyach, there's no inner peace in my world.
Right.
In noyach ba'olam, there's no inner peace in the world. Yeah. So more such statements like this coming all the way to the end of the page. As I said, each one could be a whole thing on its own.
Sure.
Okay, so the next line. Misharabu roye panim badin. When there were too many people looking at the faces of those in judgment. So Rashi doesn't explain himself. Where's the Rashi here? Yes, looking at faces. Where is that?
Of those in judgment.
Oh, yes. Sorry, there is a Rashi. I thought there was a Rashi on the previous statement. Right, Rashi writes that because people are seeking pleasure, therefore they don't push themselves to properly instruct the people on how to behave, and therefore people don't behave properly. And because of that, Hashem has no pleasure in his world. That's how Rashi interprets it. on a relationship between God and the Jewish people. I remember I was saying Rashi and I couldn't find it. Now I see it again. Yeah. Okay. It doesn't take away from what we said earlier. There's different, could be different readings of the same,
No, it just adds
the same thing.
to the equation.
But also he makes it a point of not on a personal level, but on the judges. Because the judges are seeking pleasure, they're not spending the time to set boundaries of this is permissible, this isn't permissible, because they're constantly looking just to feed their own pleasure. And therefore people who are looking to their leaders for direction don't get it. And therefore Hashem looks at this and says, like, what's going on?
Right.
Hashem has no delight in his world, no pleasure out of his world, and his world is no longer appealing to him. Sorry, what did you say?
No, I'm saying that they have a great responsibility with that because they sort of orchestrate the people.
Yeah, I would actually argue that
the conductors of the
yeah.
orchestra.
I would even argue that the interpretation we gave is dependent on Rashi's interpretation. Meaning the leadership has to set the boundaries of what's right and correct.
Of course, that's the whole.
Because if from the top down, the lines of morality are blurred because of the seeking of pleasure, and that becomes the individual's pursuit also, and then that becomes no delight in his world, right? It's a loop.
It's a domino too. I mean, if the judges are corrupt, then people.
Yeah.
You know,
Right, but judges here, remember, Torah judges are not just the judiciary; it's also the legislative branch, right? So it's not just the people who are supposed to enforce the law, but it's also the people who create the law, right? So it's a question of leadership that's meant to set this standard for moral behavior, and if they are corrupted by the seeking of pleasure, then they blur the lines of everything.
Sure.
And once the lines are blurred, no one can find peace in the world, beginning with Hashem. So the two interpretations are not disconnected, but just get that clarity. Okay, so I was looking for the Rashi in the next statement. When there were too many people who look at faces in judgment, Rashi did not explain what it means, but it would seem, and I think this is from Steinsaltz also, that it's instead of looking at the facts in judgment, they're looking at the people, the litigants themselves, and trying to see in their faces, like, who do I trust more? Right? So instead of judging based on the facts and the evidence and the law, they're judging based on like what could be on the surface sound like something that might be laudable. I'm going on intuition. He has a guilty look.
Or maybe
all right.
This one's wealthy, this one's poor.
And that's what it leads to.
Right.
So it starts off, just my interpretation, right? If you want to translate literally, it's Mishrabu Rai Panabadin, when there was too many people looking at the faces in judgment. Guru, the verse which says, don't be impressed by the litigants, has been nullified. And being, again, impressed by the litigants, whether because he's poor or rich, stops. Right? It's a pasuk in Devarim which says, not to be afraid of those in judgment, and not to look at whether they're wealthy or poor or upper standing or lower standing, judge based on the facts, right? But the way the pasuk and then the next statement is okay. So it begins with looking at faces. From there, it leads to we're no longer following the pasuk which says not to be afraid and not to take into account the litigants, but to keep the facts. And then that leads to parko al shamayim. It leads to removing the yoke of heaven. And they place on the people al basar adam, the yoke of flesh and blood of humans. So that's the line here. But the reason why I'm suggesting this interpretation is because the first and second level seem to be the same. When there's too many judges looking at the faces, the verses which says not to look at the faces and not to be impressed by the litigants was stopped. That's a repetition of the same thing, is it not? That's why I'm suggesting maybe at the beginning, looking at the faces, it seemed like not a terrible thing to do. Look at the litigants, and I have a certain intuition, like he has a guilty look in his eyes. So the judge at the beginning wasn't doing it out of, this guy's wealthy, I want to be nicer to him, or this guy's poor, I want to be nicer to him. In fact, okay, let's. This is interesting. Okay, the pasuk the Gemoro refers to here Let's pull it up. Pasuk is in Dvarim. I want to show you something interesting. Okay, you want to get a copy of the Dvarim because this is going to be interesting. The pasuk is in, where is it? Here, Dvarim, chapter 1, verse. Wait, where did it just go? Yeah, Dvarim, chapter 1, verse 7. I think it is. Let's go. Here we are. Okay. Wait, no. Not verse 7. 17, sorry. Verse 17. Okay. So the first word in the pasuk is loy sakiru panim, which means you shall not.
I'm sorry. That's chapter 2 then, no?
Chapter 1, verse 17.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it should be there. Chapter 1, verse 17.
Okay. Got it.
Okay. Loy sakiru panim is the first words. You shall not favor persons in judgment. And then it says, rather, kakatan, you shall not favor persons in judgment. And then it's, but rather, kakata and kagodol tishmun, you shall hear the small and the great equally. And then it says, you should not fear any man. So the order of the verse is, first you shall not show favor. And then it says, don't be afraid, because God's the one who judges, right? But look at the way the Gemara does it, okay? Look at the Gemara. Now compare the pasuk to the Gemara, okay? The Gemara says, Misharabu roye panabadin, when there was too many people looking at faces in judgment, bottle, it was dissolved. What comes first there?
You shall not.
Well, look at the Gemara. Which did the Gemara put first? Loisa guru.
It's Loisa guru again?
Not to be afraid. The pasuk first puts
the order.
That's right, and then it says upasak, and it stopped. Different language. Bottle dissolved. Pasak stopped. Loisakiru panim, not to show favor. So first it's always afraid, and then judgment, and then favor.
Well, fear leads to, I guess.
Why the reversal order? And one is dissolved and one stopped. So I think it's because of this. Because initially the judge isn't doing it out of a sense of fear, or even out of a sense of doing anybody a favor. He's doing it because he thinks this is the way he's going to get to the truth, by looking at their faces and seeing, where do I see guilt, instead of looking at the facts. He's relying on an intuition and looking at the faces and saying, I see a guilty face here. But once you start taking into account the person's demeanor, what's the first thing to be dissolved? Is fear. I look at his face and I see a guilty face, and that's making me want to be guilty, make him be guilty. That was my initial intent. But then when I see his guilty face, I also see the terror in his eyes. He's a murderer standing right in front of me. And I'm afraid.
You're afraid?
As a judge.
As a judge, you're afraid.
Because the pasuk says, don't be afraid. But the Gemara is saying, because I'm looking at people's faces in judgment, I'm no longer following the pasuk which says, don't be afraid. That's dissolved. And then I stop to look at the pasuk, to follow the pasuk which says not to show favor, which means order. First I look at their faces, then I start being afraid of them, then I start showing favor, and then I get rid of the yoke of heaven, and then I put the yoke of humans on them. That's the order of the Gemara.
Why is he afraid of the judge?
Sorry? Because the first step, there we go. Because the first thing he was doing was innocently, I'm just looking at the faces to see, where do I see guilt? If I'm looking at his facial expressions to find where he's guilt, I also see the terror in the eyes as a murderer, or whatever. So the pasuk says, don't be afraid, starts to go away from me. I start to be afraid. Now, once I'm ignoring the facts and looking at who am I afraid of, who I'm not afraid of, now I start looking at, oh, poor guy. Let him win. He'll make a few dollars on it. This guy's rich anyway. I start showing favor.
You're sort of the opposite of unbiased judgment.
Precisely. And what was the mistake? I went with unbiased judgment. I went by my intuition. Correct.
Elements getting
There we go.
into play.
That's right. So the first mistake was to allow my intuition to do the judging. I started looking at their faces.
I guess
And then once I open the emotion, once I open up the emotion, and now that right, judgment's supposed to be blind, right? That's the what? Sorry.
Saying once you open up the.
That's right. Once you open the basket of emotion, then fear is the first one to come roaring. Oh my gosh! Fear, you look at the terror in his eyes.
Total corruption of.
That's correct.
Of true judgment.
That's correct. And now here's what it leads to. Now no longer the yoke of heaven, but rather the yoke of people. Because what do I base my judgment on? To begin with, I'm looking at people. On people. What do I see? What do I see in them? Rather than how does Hashem look at them? How does Hashem look at them? It doesn't make a difference how I see them. Open the Torah, see how Torah says to look at them. Look at the facts. Look at the witnesses. Look at whatever the Torah says to look at. But once I start looking at people, initially I'm doing it to try to find justice. But because I relied on how I see them, so I'm afraid of them, I feel compassionate toward them, and now all of a sudden I'm no longer following the yoke of heaven, I'm following the yoke of people. What emotion do people pull out in me? And that's the basis of my judgment, the yoke of people rather than the yoke of heaven.
This is similar to the duties of the heart, the trusting in God.
There we go.
You start trusting in people rather than Hashem's.
Then you're afraid of this one, you start sucking up to that one. That's right.
Guidelines for true judgment.
Yeah. So that's on a personal level.
Yeah.
Here he's saying it on a judgment level. And I think this explains why the Gemoro reverses the order of Lo Saguru, don't be afraid. That's the first thing to go. The pasuk says don't be afraid, and then second comes the pasuk which says don't curry favor. Although the pasuk itself has it in the reverse. First it says don't curry favor, then don't be afraid. Because I imagine that when you open emotions, the first and most dominant of them is going to be fear.
Well, maybe because you need the curry of favor to trigger fear, to trigger the interpersonal relationship between a judge and a litigant.
Maybe that's why the pasuk has it in that order.
The judge he'll have no emotional tie to a litigant until there's some personal connection between them.
Or fear.
Well, once you have that personal connection established, then emotionals will play.
So I think you're right. So in the pasuk,
he knows
that's right.
The litigant on a personal level, they need to refuse them.
So the pasuk says, like you're saying, first don't curry favor, and once you curry favor, that creates the emotional relationship, and then that will lead to the fear. But the Gemara has a different way around, because the Gemara doesn't start with currying favor.
No,
the Gemara starts with looking at their faces, and I think the Gemara is going to a more.
That's the same thing. Looking at faces is the.
Well, then it's repetitive. Then it's repetitive because the Gemara says it starts with looking faces. It leads to no longer being afraid, and it leads to currying favor. That's the way the Gemara puts it, right? Which means there's a step before the Gemara is introducing. So I'm suggesting the Gemara is introducing a step before, which is I'm looking at them not to curry favor, nor to because I'm afraid. I'm looking at them as a judge because I want to rely on my intuition to see where do I see the guilty face. But once I do that, I start relying on my own judgment. The first thing to pop up is fear. And then the curry favor, which is why, because the Gemara adds that subtle level, it actually reverses the order of the pasuk. Whereas the pasuk is describing it as you are. First, the curry favor, which is the emotional establishment, and then from there, I lead to fear. But the Gemara adds a subtle level before that. I'm not looking to establish an emotional relationship with them. I'm looking to judge them based on what sense I get from them. But that's a subtle emotional attachment, and that leads to fear, which leads to currying favor, which leads to I no longer judge based on Hashem's rule. On the yoke of heaven, I judge them based on the yoke of humans. What's the human reaction I get from this person?
I think this is sort of like how we started this learning today, is that this is a snowball effect.
Exactly right.
It compounds geometrically from very tiny thing to
exactly.
a mass effect, like a small domino, which can then lead to the
That's correct.
Domino.
So the first one was you start off with just want to enjoy myself a little bit. I just want to enjoy myself. That's it.
A feather.
That's correct.
Can cause a building to topple.
That's right. So initially was I just want to enjoy myself a little bit. What's the problem? I want to enjoy myself in life a little bit, and then it slowly corrupts. And here it's another thing. I'm just using my intuition to judge. It's not a bad thing. Intuition's a good thing, isn't it? I get a sense from this person.
It starts off innocently.
Exactly right. Very innocently. I'm looking at his face and I see a guilty man. How can I not judge him guilty? But then it becomes,
If it becomes negligent, then it has gradations of liability along
that's right.
the thing.
And by the time this is over, I no longer have the yoke of heaven on me, but the yoke of humans, as he says here.
Snared.
Yeah. Okay, one more of these snowball effects. There's more. We're going to do more next week, but one more. When there was lots of people who were whispering, bedin in judgment. Whispering in judgment, as Rashi says it, is the is not even the no. It's the Gemara now. There's no pasuk here. Gemara is saying when there was too many whisperings going on in judgment. The way the Rashi puts it is that not that the litigants themselves are chatting up with the lawyers, with the judges, but the lawyers are chatting up with the judgments. They're lawyers in Torah.
Judges.
Sorry?
Chatting with the judges?
That's right. Orchei Dayanin, the Orchei Dayanin means like the lawyers. Orchei Din is a lawyer. In Torah, there's a lawyer. You can hire someone to present your case in court. So there's lawyers, and they're chatting with the judges. I'm reading from Rashi. To open up some sort of pathway in the merit of this person, whoever their litigant is, and the
Is this without the other side being present?
Doesn't say so.
Because that's a big deal.
Doesn't say so.
That's a huge
I think
violation.
Okay, once I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think it's specific to that. I think it's in general. When there's a certain fraternization between the lawyers and the judges, it opens up a lot of room for corruption. And okay, let's add this. Because as over here, the judges are not only the judiciary, they're also lawmakers. Right? They're not the what's the legislative, right?
Legislators.
They're also legislators, which would mean the modern version of this is lobbyists hanging out with senators. That would be the modern version of this. When there's too much, right? When there's too much fraternization between the lawyers, the people who are supposed to be, and the lawmakers. When the lawmakers are chatting too much with the people who are defending a particular party or a particular person, this leads to mad corruption. Right? And therefore, this causes way too much anger amongst the Jewish people. And the Stalka Shechina and the presence of Hashem is gone. Because now no longer, because judgment is completely corrupted. Because the pasuk says, the Kedev Elakim Yishbait. Amidst the judges does God judge. But once the judges, the ones who are making the law and imposing the law, are hanging out with lawyers, literally the Gemara's literal language is, as Rashi puts it, lawyers are chatting up with the judges too much. But again, the judges are also legislators, which means the lawyers here would be people who represent a certain party to the legislators.
Right,
and if they're
vested interest in their side.
That's right. So this whole cocktail party of lawyers and judges, today's you have all of them. Lawyers, judges, legislators, and lobbyists all hang out in the same clubs, in the same golf clubs, in the same bars, in the same everywhere. And it's not like they're giving same social clubs. And the way the Gemara puts it is not that they're bribing necessarily, but just means whispering whispers. They're just whispering whispers. They're socialites. They're having a good time together. They're sharing. They're exchanging ideas, inviting each other over to their homes. This leads to huge corruption. And without even realizing it, the legislators are without even realizing it, maybe directly realizing it, I don't know. But the legislators become corrupt. The judges become corrupt. The lawyers are corrupt because everybody's chatting up everybody else. Serious commentary on things that we might be very well aware of nowadays.
Seems more obvious today than ever before, at least in my.
Yeah. And the Gemara's language is very interesting. It's not like the Gemara doesn't say straight out that there's bribery. But whispers are whispering.
It doesn't have to be the bribery in the traditional sense.
Exactly.
It could be social bribery.
Yeah.
I know this guy, he's my friend.
Exactly.
It's bribery, where you should recuse yourself.
That's right.
You don't.
And after the court's over, we'll go out for lunch.
Yeah. You see it a lot in the court when a judge is friendly to a litigant. because the lawyer, they'll introduce evidence, whatever he wants. Okay, the other side, oh, the judge will stop, not allow.
Yep.
That's preclusion of evidence on the other side.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this says the Gemara leads to anger amongst the Jewish people. So the literal meaning of the Gemara, anger amongst the Jewish people, as Rashi puts it, is Hashem's anger. Hashem's anger, because there's all this corruption. And if the presence of Hashem is gone, but we could interpret it as two different things. Lots of anger amongst the Jewish people, that the Jewish people get angry.
With themselves? Among themselves?
They are angry at their leadership. You have an angry population. When they look at their leadership and they just see this massive corruption, we see this today, where people are chomping at the bit because of the swamp that is the political leading class. And this whole cocktail of media socialites hanging out with politicians, hanging out with lawyers, hanging out with judges, and they all, sorry?
It's like the little boys club.
Yeah, there's this bubble of socialite that goes on, and the rest of the populace looking at this fuming. So even though the Gemara says Rabbi Chanan Af Yisrael, and as Rashi explains it, it means God's anger, but we could interpret it as the people's anger. And also when it's Shechina and the presence of God is removed. Hashem's not going to be party to this. Hashem judges amongst the judges that are fair, that are just, that are upright. But when there's this when there's this chatting up between the lawyers and the politicians and everything else, so you have God angry and the people angry also.
Yeah.
So more such social commentary, God willing, on Monday. Wonderful day.